Hello and welcome to Communication Between Cultures, Chapter 10. In this portion of Chapter 10, we're going to be discussing education, the cultural influences on the educational setting. All right, so before we start talking about how culture influences education, you may be wondering again, just like we talked about with the healthcare setting, why are we discussing education? I mean, how is this relatable to you? If you are not going into education or intending to be a teacher in the future, why do you need to know this information? I would challenge you that not everybody who ends up being an educator intends to be an educator from the very beginning. I never in my life thought I would be teaching classes or standing in front of a classroom, but here I am. Uh, Many people who go into different kinds of areas without not necessarily teaching end up teaching that later on, whether it be in a formal type of setting like in a university or a classroom of some sort like an academic setting like what we're in now, or it may simply be training in your chosen field. Maybe after you've gotten some experience under your belt, you're going to be training the next generation who comes in about how to do particular things. So a lot of teaching goes along or goes on outside of the traditional classroom. So just because you may not be going into education as your profession does not mean that you won't be either one doing it later on in life, or two, teaching in a different capacity rather than just the traditional setting. So, in any rate, this information is going to be something that you're going to be able to need to understand and incorporate as you go forth with your life and potentially ending up being an educator. This information may also help you as a student as well to understand your fellow students and be able to work better with them in groups. So let's talk about how culture influences education and why we need to know this. Not only as educators but also as students, we've noticed and are influenced by the fact that we have growing numbers of immigrants and former foreign scholars who are changing the face of our classrooms. There are very few classrooms these days that are completely only one race or having one cultural background represented or one religion represented. We are finding more and more diversity within our society and therefore within our classrooms. What schools teach is influenced by culture. So while all cultures will generally teach history and language, each culture will inevitably give their own primary importance. Therefore, in an English-speaking country, English is going to be your primary focus. In a Spanish-speaking country, Spanish is going to be your primary focus. I mean, if you look at your own education, so think back, how many English-related classes did you take as opposed to your foreign languages that weren't even required? Uh, when you look at history, how much world history did you learn as opposed to how much American history that you learned? More likely than not, generally most students take one, maybe two, as often as an elective world history or world civilizations for the entire world, and at the same time then maybe taking two or even three required American history courses throughout their lifetimes or throughout their schooling. Each culture also tends to glorify its own accomplishments and minimize those of others. So anytime that you learn about history in a classroom, you're going to learn about that history with a skewed perspective. And generally, it's going to be from the perspective of the culture that you are, that is actually teaching you, right? You're going to learn about history from a European perspective very differently than Americans learn about the same thing. If you talk to a European about World War II, they're going to have very different information and very different perspectives about what happened, what the causes were, uh, what you know the fallout was, what the follow-up was, then you would learn in an American history classroom. While you're looking at the same thing, and history is what it is, right? But history is always going to be taught with from a different perspective. To give an example, my as you know, my husband is from Italy, right? So when I talked to him and I talked to his mother about World War II, and we talked to them about Mussolini, they have a very different opinion on Mussolini than we were taught when we were in growing up in American history classes. We were taught basically that Mussolini was a dictator, was a ruthless dictator who hurt his own people. But their view of Mussolini is very different. That he was a statesman, that he benefited Italy quite a bit, at least when he was in the first part of his reign. Um, they, you know, he did a lot of really great things for Italy. Once World War II came, they feel that he was influenced, had got some bad influences, and did some things that he should not have done. But those things, for the most part, for the majority of Italians who lived during that time period, they really don't see that as being bad enough to taint their view of Benito Mussolini. They overall have a fairly positive attitude toward Benito Mussolini as opposed to a negative one, which is surprising considering how negative the perception of that particular leader is here in the United States. But I mean, that's not what we're focusing on. But that's just an example about how, of how different perspectives can affect the way history is taught. We also have some schools and some cultures that emphasize the importance of original thought and creation, and that's generally our individualistic cultures, while other cultures emphasize the importance of learning and perpetuating the teachings of experts, and then we'll generally see that in collective cultures. As a result, we see very different attitudes towards things such as plagiarism. In collective cultures, it is considered the right thing to do to learn from scholars' writings, to repeat what they said, to learn what they said, and not to change what they said with your own interjection, your own individual thought, your own additional opinions. Your opinions don't matter. What matters is the information that's being taught to you by people who know more than you. And that's a very different attitude than what we have here in individualistic societies, where taking somebody else's words and repeating them is a severe enough infraction that you can actually be thrown out of school for it. So, for here, we encourage people to have their own ideas, their own initiatives, their own thoughts, their own opinions, just like in your essay number 2, where I told you I do not want you to tell me what Hofstede said. I want you to come up with your own analysis. Um, and then that's a very individualistic mindset. I want you to come up with your own opinions, use your own knowledge, and not worry about what the quote unquote experts had to say. And that's very different. So we have problems when people from individualist or from collective cultures come here to individualistic cultures, and they try to repeat things in the way that they were taught was correct, and then they sometimes get into trouble with plagiarism here and in the individualistic educational system. We also see that how schools teach is influenced by culture. Some schools encourage students to be vocal and very physically participated or participants in the class, where other cultures do not want students to talk in class. They do not want students to be participants, physical participants in class. They want students to sit quietly and listen to the teacher's lecture. And this also tends to fall along individualistic versus collective lines, because in individualistic uh, cultures, we encourage people to speak up. We encourage people to be a part of something, to put their 2 cents and their spin on everything. Whereas in a collective culture, We want people to learn from us, from the experts. We want people to hear what we have to say and not necessarily elaborate on that. Um, so we have those different approaches. Also, in some countries, students are unable to have individual textbooks, not necessarily for a cultural value reason, but simply just because they can't afford it or they're not available. So the students tend to be more quiet rather than active participants because they're busy listening to the lecture and writing down notes because they have no textbook to which they can refer back later if they miss something in class. And so we may have students who tend to be less engaged in the classroom, not because of any kind of cultural value particularly, but simply because they have to be. They have to be paying attention and they have to be making notes. They don't have the opportunity to do that and also be active participants. We also see teacher-student relations vary according to culture. Some cultures encourage students to question and challenge teachers, whereas other cultures would find that to be very rude and disrespectful. We saw that in one of the chapter 6 scenarios, one of the chapter 6 lesson scenarios that you did, where we had the American and the Indian classroom, and whether or not that American should have spoken to the teacher about his disagreement during the class or taken the time to talk to the teacher after class more privately. Uh, it's just, that's what we're seeing here. Teacher-student relations are going to vary, and it tends to follow along whether or not a culture is high power distance versus whether a culture is low power distance. In a low power distance our culture, we tend to encourage students to speak up, be heard, to even challenge the teacher, and as long as it's done respectfully, that's perfectly fine. But in other more low or high power distance cultures, no matter how respectful you are, that's not going to be okay. Not in front of the other students, not in the classroom. Maybe afterwards, privately, that would be fine, but not in the classroom. In the multicultural classroom, teachers are challenged with both having to learn about and accommodate the varied expectations and the learning processes, the differences in learning processes that come from different cultures, but also challenged in trying to create a good academic atmosphere so that all of the students in that classroom can learn and feel comfortable in that classroom, to create kind of a diverse community where each person feels like they belong in that classroom. And that's not easy to do. So let's talk a little bit about how to do that. First of all, let's talk about learning preferences. So if we're going to, as a teacher in a multicultural classroom or in a diverse classroom, if we're going to be able to accommodate varied expectations and learning processes, we need to know some of the variations in how students tend to learn. Uh, Learning preferences are defined as the methods by which an individual prefers to gather and process information, learn and solve problems. So this is the way a person learns, or how the way a person prefers to learn. Now, culture is only one of the factors that influences a person's learning preference. Therefore, you may have people within the same culture who follow very many varied learning preferences based upon other influences in their personalities. But culture does tend to affect these things. So, your culture is going to influence what learning preference you may be. And this may even be a greater influence in more collective or homogenous cultures than in more diverse cultures like our own. A person's cultural background and experiences teach us what our reality is. Also, therefore, it was going to teach us what is important in our reality and therefore how we learn our reality. And for that reason, culture will influence the way that we learn. For example, as we talked about before, some cultures may put more emphasis on learning about facts and scientific method. These may be more important than learning about more traditional types of knowledge, such as knowledge that was passed down from generations that maybe doesn't have scientific proof, but we know it's true because it was always considered to be true. That may or may not have a great deal of weight in the academic setting. But in other cultures, sometimes that will have actually more weight. The weight of experience will have um, more validity than the weight of scientific proof or scientific method. All right, so let's talk about the first of the cultural learning preferences. That's field independence versus field sensitivity. And I will warn you that these cultural learning preferences, as we read through them, do tend to read a bit like horoscopes. So I want you to think about, as we do talk about them, which of these horoscopes or which of these preferences you tend to fall into. Which one would you define yourself by, and why do you think that would define you? Why do you feel that that makes you more comfortable or is more effective for you? All right, so let's talk about field independence versus field sensitivity. Field sensitive individuals are more focused on the details of their environment. They are sensitive to the nuances of that environment. They prefer to work in groups and seek guidance from teachers. These are often members of more high context cultures. Field independent individuals, on the other hand, are more analytical and focus on more abstract stimuli in their environment. They prefer to work independently, are task oriented, and enjoy individual competition. These are often members of low context cultures. They would probably also be members of individualistic cultures, whereas field sensitive individuals are more likely to be members of collective cultures. The next learning preference is cooperation versus competition. This is a learning style which reflects how students like to work and be recognized for their work, whether or not you prefer to work as a group or work individually, whether or not you prefer to be evaluated as part of a group or individually. And not surprisingly, this tends to fall along lines of individualism versus collectivism as well. People from individualistic cultures usually prefer to be evaluated as an individual, prefer to work as an individual rather than working in a group. Most times in a collective culture, however, you would find that students prefer to work in groups and be evaluated as a group rather than as an individual. And you know that this is true every time here in the United States you've been assigned a group project. Most people pretty much groan. Okay, they do not like group projects here in the United States, which is one of the reasons we always try to do a group project to try and get you more comfortable with that type of learning, that type of working, since it's actually something that is a very important skill to have in the workplace. But we tend not to like it very much. We also have the next learning preference is trial and error versus watch then do. This is the idea that some people prefer to learn by engaging themselves in a task and learning as they go. Essentially, the people who buy a new phone take out the instructions, throw them over their shoulder, and turn on the phone and start playing with it, right? And or we have the others who would rather get instructions and see the task demonstrated before attempting it. So this is the person who gets the phone, opens up the phone, sees the phone, sets it to the side, takes out the instructions and start reading it, or maybe watching a YouTube video on it, how to use it or something before they turn the phone on. Uh, this, not surprisingly, kind of correlates with the top down versus bottom up decision making process that we talked about in the professional setting. The bottom up decision making process is a type is kind of a reflective of the watch then do learning preference. They want to figure out all the problems. They want to, do little trials and decide what could possibly happen, learn what it might happen, learn how to do something before they actually do it. So before the decision is actually made and implementation begins, they're already going to know what they're going to run into. It's not a surprise. Versus the top down decision making process where the decisions are made quickly and then we figure it out as we go along as we implement the plan. So while we're talking about learning preferences here, these learning preferences are indications of our other types of more professional behaviors as well, not just our learning behaviors. Tolerance versus intolerance for ambiguity. Some cultures don't mind a certain amount of uncertainty and structure and are less tied to logic and rationalism, while others adhere to very structured schedules and emphasize polar and distinct values such as right, wrong, yes, no, etc. So I think, for example, we we are a culture who does not tolerate ambiguity well. We like certainty. Now, that certainty is diverse, right? So your certainty is not necessarily the same as my certainty, but we do tend to like to know what's going to happen, what is expected of us, exactly what is needed. We do follow very structured schedules. We don't like gray areas. We get uncomfortable when a question is a gray kind of question or a direction is more gray. But, there are some people who prefer to have more grayness. That way they can actually uh, interpret for themselves and are more comfortable with that. Um, we also find that in some cases, many collective cultures um, will be emphasizing more distinct values, just right versus wrong, have structured schedules as well. So this isn't necessarily an individualistic versus collective mentality. Japan, for example, would also be very tied to logic and rationalism, would be wanting very structured schedules and people to be on time. And they have the right way of doing things and the wrong way of doing things, even more so than we do here in the United States. But a good example of a culture that doesn't mind as much the uncertainty, a low avoidance culture who maybe has uh, less tie to structured schedules, would be the Latin American cultures. And so they're a little bit of ambiguity in their life. They're a little bit more comfortable with that than we are. All right, so let's take a look at some relational styles for learning. These are different learning styles that have to do with how you relate to your teachers, how you relate to your peers. Um, and the first one is dependency versus independence. This is the degree to which students rely on the support, help, and opinions of their teachers. You know, the students who are maybe don't know the answer to something or maybe have a question about a project, they're the ones that are going to talk to the teacher after class or call the teacher or email the teacher to get direction before they continue on with their project, whereas those who will simply interpret for themselves and barrel ahead with whatever their interpretation is without asking. Uh, this is and some students prefer to get to know exactly what is expected of them to get that kind of direction from the teacher, whereas others would rather be kind of left to their own devices and left to do their own interpretations. Then we have those participation versus passivity. These are students who prefer to be actively engaged in the learning process, while some other students prefer to be more passive. And this would fall along the lines of what we talked about earlier, uh, individualism versus collectivism, right? So students who are coming from individualistic cultures tend to be more actively engaged, tend to want to be heard. They're from low context cultures. They are want to have their opinion be a part of the discussion, whereas other students who really don't feel as much that their opinion matters, but that they are there to learn whatever the teacher has to teach them, and it's not really their place to interject their own uneducated opinions. So again, that's more of a collective ideology. Impulsivity versus reflectivity. This is reflected in how long it takes a student to answer a question. This has to do a lot with the different uses of silence that we talked about in Chapter 9. Some students and some cultures are encouraged to answer a question the moment that you ask it. Here in the United States, if we ask somebody a question, we expect an answer back immediately, right? Right away. And if a student doesn't answer our question right away, we assume that that student doesn't know. So we'll probably just, okay, say, all right, then you don't know, and then move on and ask another student. But in some cultures, that pause to think before answering, is a sign of respect, of reflectivity on your question, rather than jumping to answer the question quickly, just spitting out whatever the first garbage that comes to my mind. I'm going to actually think about your question and then give you a thought out answer. So we have problems with that in the classroom, in a diverse classroom, because like for example, here in the United States, most teachers, educators expect to be answered right away, and then when they're not, they move on, not giving the opportunity to that person to actually say what they thought the answer was. Now oftentimes people who are coming from more reflective cultures will know the answer. They'll take that pause, though, before answering, as a matter of respect, to show reflectivity, not because they don't know the answer. So that, if we move on then without giving them the opportunity to give their answer, then we're actually, losing out on whatever it is they had to say, and they're losing out on the ability, or the opportunity to participate in the learning experience as well. All right, so cultural motivation styles. These are different learning ways, or rather, so different ways that people are motivated to learn. So first of all, we have intrinsic motivation. For some students, simply excelling at a task is sufficient reward. They have an internal drive to succeed. They don't need any kind of external reward. They just need that feeling that they did the best that they could. Extrinsic motivations. These are students who lack more of an internal drive, and they seek more external reward. And that may be a grade, or in maybe smaller or younger classes, it may be an actual reward or a prize, or even just praise from the teacher. But they need some kind of extrinsic motivation in order to get them to learn. They don't just learn for the heck for the sake of learning, right? Uh, Now we often see from a cultural perspective, the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivated students. We will see a difference between cultures that are more materialistic versus cultures that are less materialistic. Perhaps maybe more, if you want to put it in Hofstede's words, the masculinity versus femininity cultures, or the career success orientation versus the relationship cultures. Um, um, Whereas in those cultures, part of that determination is uh, materialism. In more materialistic cultures, extrinsic motivation tends to be a more prevalent, whether it be even just a simple a grade. That's still an intrinsic motivation. It's something that they can see, something tangible. Um, Whereas an intrinsic motivated student will simply do well at a task and will do something just because they feel that they're going to benefit from it, or just because that helps them to feel more thorough, or because they feel that they get some kind of internal reward for doing that. For example, I know that I have assigned you some language awareness readings that we have not discussed in class that are not assigned to any particular written assignment, or are not on the test. How many of you actually read them? I'm sure some of you did and some of you didn't, and you know who you are, okay? Those who did tend to be more intrinsically motivated students. They did it not because there's any reward attached to it, but simply because doing the best that they can, learning as much as they can, is its own reward for them. Those who didn't, it's not that they're lazy or they're bad students, but there simply wasn't any gain to be had, any tangible gain to be had from doing that task, so they weren't interested in doing that task. Some students learn better when they are told what to learn despite their own interest or their own motivations, and they do okay with that. All right, so even if they're not interested in the subject, but they're simply told that they have to do that subject. I may not be interested in math, but because I'm told I have to do well in math, I will do well in math. I don't see its use for myself, but I'll do it anyway. That is a learning on demand student. Uh, on the other hand, we have learning when interested students. These are students that believe that they should only have to learn what is useful and interesting to them. So if they can't see the use for information, that they're gonna zone out and not really do very well on that information because they don't see how it relates to them, how it relates to their needs. They don't they're not interested in just learning it for the sake of learning it. They want to learn it for the sake of, for a purpose, or because they're interested in it. We see the people that are learning when interested often tend to be extrinsically motivated people as well. We also tend to see that these are people who come from um, more independent cultures, whereas where you're taught that your opinions and your interests are your individual opinions and interests are important to your lives. Whereas learning on demand students tend to be coming from more collective cultures because they are more motivated by what they are what society expects of them rather than what they individually prefer. All right, the another approach that we're going to talk about when it comes to trying to understand how people perceive the world and prefer to learn is what we see here on this culture and this or on this culture on this slide, and this really reads like horoscopes. So more than anything else, this is going to read like a horoscope. It's also pretty self-explanatory. So I'm going to just read through it here. But it's important to understand that this is a method to understanding not just how people learn, but how people perceive their world, how they make judgments upon what motivations and what information do they draw to make those judgments, to make those perceptions, to try and learn about their environment. And this is something that is influenced, definitely influenced by culture, but by other things as well. Experiences, family experiences, just personality. All right, so this can be, even within a single culture, you're going to see a lot of people have very many varied types of learning or types of preferences. These types of learning preferences, and in fact, I'm sure that if I were to ask each and every one of you which preference you defined yourself by, we would have at least one or two of you in each group. All right, even though the majority of you come from the American culture. Not all of you, I know, but the majority of you do. We're going to see that there's going to be quite diversity in what you how you define yourself. But let's read it over. First of all, we've got our sensing thinking, our mastery preference. These are students who are organized, efficient, and practical. They prefer hands on activity, want step by step instructions, and like to know exactly what is expected of them. These are those students who are going to read the rubric over and over and over again and look at every little detail and every little word, as opposed to maybe somebody who doesn't read, maybe skims the rubric or doesn't look at it at all. All right, sensing, feeling, interpersonal preference. Independent learners who like to work things out for themselves. These students are logical and organized and concerned about long range goals. So these are people who are also going to be very organized, just like the sensing thinking or the mastery preference, but people who also like to do their own kind of interpretation. They don't necessarily want to be told exactly what they have to do, but maybe just given guidance and then uh, you know figure the rest out for themselves. Then we have the understanding preference, our intuitive thinking. These are curious, insightful, and imaginative. These students are committed to their values, dare to dream, open to new and unique ways of expressing themselves. They are not afraid to be different and enjoy dealing with open ended questions such as what if? This is my son. He's always asking me, well, what if this and what if that? And I know that little kids do that, but he's 15. But yes, he does this a lot. And that's because this is kind of him. He wants to figure things out. He wants to understand things, but he also wants to put his own spin on it. He wants to look at new ways of looking at things. He doesn't like it when we try to tell him, no, it's not that way. It has to be this way. So, well, why does it have to be this way? And that's kind of his approach to learning, is trying to think of not what it is, but what it could be. Then we have our intuitive thinking or self-expressive preference. These people are sensitive to theirs and others' feelings. They are more concerned with information that they feel is relevant to their lives. They need to be relaxed and comfortable to learn, and are often spontaneous and do what feels right to them. They make no distinction between school and real life, and when school becomes too detached from real life, they become disinterested. So these are going to be students who really need to understand, with everything that they learn, what this means to them specifically. They're not just going to learn it because the teacher says they have to learn it or their parents say they have to learn it. They're going to learn it when they feel that that's going to benefit them in some way in their life, that it's relevant to them. All right, let's talk a little bit about language in the classroom. A person's native language, as we've talked about before, is crucial to their identity. So your language is a part of who you are. And then when you are entering then a school system that uses a different language than your native language, you're forced to assimilate into that culture and into that language, which is then essentially leaving a part of who you are behind. So it sometimes causes a lot of difficulty and discomfort for somebody who is entering a system, is or entering a new linguistic, or entering a classroom that uses a different language, not just because of the difficulties in communication from a linguistic disability type of situation, but also because of an identity type of situation. They just don't necessarily feel quite like they belong. A teacher, however, can minimize this discomfort by respecting and incorporating the student's language into the curriculum. Now, how a teacher does that is going to vary depending upon the subject matter. It's going to vary depending upon the level of the the academic well, I'm sorry, the level of the classroom, whether we're talking about like kindergartners or high school students or college students or professionals. How you approach this is going to be very different. But in pretty much any level, a teacher can simply incorporate maybe a greeting in a particular person's language. If I know that I have students from different cultures in my classroom, I might incorporate a greeting from each of those languages on different days, or maybe a parting, um, or maybe ask them every once in a while how they would describe something, in their language, rather than just having them describe things in our language. A good example of this from a preschool level. Oh, when my son was in preschool, he had a little Japanese boy who joined the class, and the Japanese boy was still learning English. Uh, but to make the Japanese boy feel more comfortable and to also help the other students in the classroom kind of accept him a little bit better, they incorporated his language in a very innovative way. I don't know how many of you have been in a preschool classroom before, but if you have, you've noticed that in order to help these students with their pre-reading skills, a lot of times you'll see different objects have the words of them written on the objects. For example, they'll have the word door on the door, the word window on the word window, or on the window, and so on and so forth, the word desk on the desk, and so on and so forth, okay? So they already had this up in English. When the Japanese boy came, they wrote all of the words in Japanese and put that as well on the window. So we had window in English and we also had window in Japanese. We had door in English and door in Japanese. And now that's not to say that they were teaching all of those or those preschoolers Japanese. They may have been, but they were exposing them to the fact that language can be different, exposing them to the fact that language can look different, and also just kind of making the Japanese boy feel more comfortable, because this was a place in which a very important part of himself was being recognized. It also made him look cool in the eyes of the other preschoolers instead of weird or strange or in some way disabled because he was not a native English speaker and didn't really understand English very well. Foreign and immigrant students have difficulty in U.S. schools for four main reasons. First of all, when we have non-native English speakers, they not only have to concentrate on the subject matter that's being taught, but they also have to concentrate on decoding the language in which it's being taught. Therefore, the cognitive demand on them is much greater than the cognitive demand on the students who are learning in their native language, because they can focus on just learning the material, whereas the non-native speaker has to learn has to decode everything into a new language and try to understand that, as well as trying to understand the difficulties of the material that they are learning. We also find that we have cases of academic insufficiency, where the school system that the students came from is at a different level than the school system that they're going into. Either are behind from the school system that they're moving into, so they're trying to play catch up, trying to learn the things that the students around them already know, or they're being held back because they already know the information that the students around them are being taught. The higher the level the school in which a person is enrolling, the more difficult it is for them. Now we tend to focus on little kids, right? When we think, oh, how terrible it is for the kindergartner, or the first grader, or the third grader that's thrown into a situation where they can't talk to anybody. But it's actually they adapt. They learn and they adapt very quickly. It's actually the people who are entering at the high school level or the college level who really have it difficult, because it's much harder to learn the language, decode a language, and try to communicate and learn in a different language when you're learning things like algebra and chemistry and all kinds of more complicated economics or engineering types of of classes and information. Those are going to be much harder than learning how to do your ABCs and your 1, 2, 3s and 1 plus 1 equals 2 and 2 plus 2 equals 4 and so on and so forth that you would have at the lower levels. So it's actually harder for the for the older students and the adult students than it is for the younger kids. We may also run into the situation that we talked about earlier when we talked about how schools or what schools teach is different depending from culture to culture. The school curriculums that a student may be coming from may have had a very different focus or a different perspective on the same material than the school system that they're going into now. So they may have studied World War II along with their American counterparts, but the knowledge that they have of that particular piece of history is going to be very different. So when they come into then to the American classroom, they may not have the same perspectives or the same information that is the base of the information for the students who are there. All right, so how can then a teacher help with this situation? You must be multiculturally competent, right? Just like in all the other areas that we've talked about. How do you become multiculturally competent? Just like we said before, you must first understand yourself. You've got to know yourself before you can know others. You have to recognize that your own perceptions and behaviors are culturally based, and therefore your attitudes toward information and the information that you know to be true is actually uh, based upon a cultural perception and is not necessarily black and white, that there are other ways to approach information and other ways to approach learning than what has always worked for you or what that you are most comfortable with. Be cognizant of and combat any stereotypes, prejudices, racist attitudes that you might hold. And I know that the majority of us are going to say, well, I'm not prejudiced, I'm not racist, I love everybody. All right. But even we have to be honest with ourselves. Even the most multiculturally competent individual is going to hold some kind of latent stereotypes or prejudices, maybe not because they want to, but simply because they've had that influence as they were formulating their personalities. And so, even myself, sometimes I will have a thought pop into my head that is very stereotypical or not particularly flattering of a particular group of people. And I basically have to stop myself and give myself a slap on the wrist, and say, hey, where did that thought come from? You know better than that. And stop myself. Combat those kinds of thoughts that tend to pop up out of your subconscious when you're least expecting it. We all have it. We all have to be aware of it. We all have to be honest about it. And that way we can combat it when it does happen. All right, understanding diversity. Teachers need to take the initiative to learn about the cultural backgrounds and educational needs of the students that are in their classrooms. If they understand the different learning preferences and the ways that students learn and the expectations that students will have of the teachers and of the assignments, then they can start incorporating practices that will engage those students as well as engaging the students who are already in their classrooms. This way, too, they'll help them to not misinterpret behaviors and respond inappropriately, such as when we talked about a student who may take some time to reflect upon an answer before answering it. Rather than assuming that that student doesn't know, the teacher might be able to understand what that means in that culture and give that student a little time, a minute or so to reflect, or maybe even try to throw the question out there some time before they might call on that individual. The teacher must also promote cultural awareness and acceptance within the classroom, right? Not just from his or herself, but also from the other students in the classroom. The teacher is responsible for developing a classroom atmosphere that integrates all the represented cultures, not just the dominant culture. You want to make sure that you're providing opportunities to discuss matters of interest for all the cultures and nationalities that are represented in your classroom. If you know that something is going on in that particular person's classroom, maybe you can try to incorporate, or I'm sorry, in the classroom, in that particular person's culture or country of origin, perhaps you can try to incorporate a discussion of that if it's something the person would feel comfortable talking about into the classroom. All right. Maybe that's not possible given the type of information or the type of class that it is, but you might still want to take 5 or 10 minutes out of the classroom to just kind of move away from your normal curriculum to just have a little bit of a discussion on that, if that's a possibility for you. Encourage discussions about unique values, beliefs, and practices, and make sure that all students feel safe and comfortable in being who they are in your classroom, that they don't have to hide who they are or hide what their opinions are, what their perceptions are, but it's okay to express differences of opinions and differences in perceptions, maybe differences in religious practices that aren't common in that classroom. A good example of this, when my daughter was in first grade, uh, her teacher was a good teacher, but had not taken the time to learn about the fact that a religious holiday was coming up for this Muslim student. Now, when my daughter had to tell her that she wasn't going to be in class the next day because it was Eid, it's not that her teacher gave her a hard time about it, but when my daughter talked to the other students about it, saying, I'm not going to be in class tomorrow because it's Eid, the other students had never heard of Eid before, and so they teased her and they said, "Oh, you're skipping school, and that's just a lie. There's no such thing as Eid. We've never heard of that before." And my daughter, this is first grade, right? So she comes home and she's crying and she's telling me she doesn't want to be Muslim anymore because the other students teased her and told her that Eid didn't exist and that she was just lying. So I called her teacher, and her teacher, when she heard that, she was distressed, and she invited me to come in and talk to the classroom about what Eid was and share some information about it, and that way, and in that way, I did do that. So in that way, my daughter was able to come up in front of the class with her mom, and we showed them the mehndi that was on our hands and talked about what we did, and we read them a story about what Eid was and about a Muslim child celebrating Eid with his family. And after that, now Eid was cool, and she was happy to be Muslim because it was, she was the star of the attention, right? And my daughter loves being the center of attention, uh, even now. But just being able to incorporate that, her teacher took the time out of her curriculum to allow me to come in and do that because she felt that it was important. Now, frankly, she could have thought to do that before this happened, before I had to call her with a problem. But, at least she did it afterwards, and that was a great thing. So, but if you are a truly multicultural teacher, you're going to know and anticipate that this might be an issue and try to bring in uh, these kinds of discussions before we have problems like that. Now, that's an example of very young children, but we certainly do have this, and the workplace. We have it in uh, more adult education as well. And we do this, you see often on Robert Morris campus, encouraging diversity. We've got lots of diversity programming here on Robert Morris campus in order to help with that, exactly just this type of thing, to encourage our students to share their values and their beliefs, to feel comfortable in who they are. Uh, in many workplaces today, diversity awareness is becoming a very important focus, where you will not only have classes on diversity awareness, but I know UPMC has a diversity fair every year. I've gone in to do henna tattoos or mehndi for their diversity fair, They will encourage people to, on their lunch breaks, to come and join this fair where they'll get to try different kinds of ethnic foods, maybe get a henna tattoo, or to see different kinds of cultural clothing and so on and so forth, and then just kind of encourage this sort of thing in the workplace as well. You also want to give opportunities for cross-cultural collaboration by assigning group projects with diverse members. If you recall from Chapter 7, one of the best ways to combat any type of stereotypes, prejudices, or racism is to put people together on an equal plane to work together to accomplish a collective goal. And that's the best way to get people to understand one another and work together, and to see each other as equals. So you want to make sure that you do this as a teacher, to give this opportunity and kind of force them into situations, rather than just giving them the opportunity to do so, but force them into situations that require them to engage members, the more diverse members of the classroom. But when you do that, you need to be alert for cultural conflict as well. As you know, cultural conflict is always going to happen. You want to recognize the potential for culturally based misunderstandings, and you want to is particularly with certain volatile topics, right? You want to make sure that you are able to entertain multiple perspectives on different topics, but at the same time, you need to establish some ground rules, saying that, we can talk about this, but we're not going to maybe talk directly at one another. We're going to direct all of the conversation toward the teacher, um, or however you want to do it, but to make sure that it doesn't get out of hand. Uh, Knowing that there are going to be different opinions, and these opinions may be held very culturally dear to one's heart, but at the same time, these opinions may have very different there may be students in that classroom that have very different opinions to what is maybe more common in that classroom. This is true also in the workplace. Many of the most common uh, human resources issues that people see in the workplace are based upon cultural misunderstandings, conflicts that arise because people have different perspectives on how to employ touch, or how to employ eye contact, or what is appropriate or not appropriate to say in any given context. A lot of the human resources issues that we see in most workplaces often arise from these differences in cultural understandings and perceptions. We want to make sure that classroom expectations and procedures are clear, both verbally and in writing. Plagiarism and late work policies are two big ones for this. Plagiarism, because of what we talked about earlier, the attitude of collective cultures versus the attitude of individualistic cultures. Here, where plagiarism is a big thing that can actually get you expelled from school. Uh, what is plagiarism? They've never heard of plagiarism. Plagiarism is what we would call plagiarism is exactly what they've always been taught to do. What they think that they're supposed to do, what is expected of them. So they don't understand the concept of plagiarism because they don't have it in their culture. So we need to really sit down and help these students to understand what plagiarism is, because they're going to be expected to adhere to the plagiarism rules of the culture of the educational system that they're in. So when we have students coming here from collective cultures that view what we would call plagiarism in a very different way, in a positive way as opposed to a negative way, we need to sit down with them and explain to them what plagiarism is, why it is not encouraged in our culture, and what is expected of them. We can't just assume that they're going to understand that just because we do. Late work policies are important, particularly when you have students that have different attitudes towards time management. In some cultures, it's perfectly acceptable to turn work in late. Whereas in many cultures like ours, or even we tend to be a little bit more relaxed than maybe perhaps the German culture, where things are expected to be on time. And if you have a late work policy where things are expected to be on time and are not going to be accepted late, or if they're accepted late, are going to have repercussions as a result of having something turned in late, you need to make sure that that policy is understood and well planned, or uh, well communicated, both in writing and verbally, just in case maybe linguistic deficiencies might uh, complicate the verbal communication. You want to make sure that it is in writing so that that student can make sure that they've had the opportunity to read through it and understand it completely, so that they're not surprised later on when they turn something in late and they either it doesn't get accepted or they get a significant reduction in points for it. Teacher-student communication strategies are important also to communicate, particularly when you have students who maybe are from high power distance cultures. If you're from a low power distance culture, the communication strategies that are common in low power distance cultures may not be comfortable for students from high power distance cultures. They may be more comfortable with something more in writing rather than face to face. So you want to make sure that they understand what is the best way to communicate with you, and to make sure that you have strategies that are open for both types of communicators. You want to make sure, too, that you diversify your teaching strategies to incorporate all the different types of learning preferences and motivation styles that we talked about. For example, you want to make sure that you have opportunities for both people who are extrinsically motivated and the people who are intrinsically motivated. So you want to provide opportunities for tangible rewards as well as intangible rewards. You want to be able to make sure that people can feel good about what they're doing and give them the opportunity to do something just for the heck of it, because that's what makes them feel good, but also make sure that you have a lot of things out there for which for those extrinsically motivated students too, for which you will receive grades or prizes or some kind of tangible, physical, immeasurable reward. You want to assign both groups and individual projects with both group and individual assessment. So most of your classes here at Robert Morris, you'll find that we have individual assessments, individual projects. Like in our classroom, like your first two essays are both individual, but your third project is a group project, and that's pretty common here in many of our classrooms, many of our classes, in that we will have both individual and group projects. And then this way we incorporate both those students who prefer to work or are more comfortable working in groups, and those students who are less comfortable working in groups and prefer to work more individually. You also want to diversify your assignments to require either adherence to specific tasks or creativity, or both. This gives each student the opportunity to perform in a manner that is comfortable to them. So what this means is that you're giving them, you're going to have some assignments that are very narrowly focused. You're told, maybe you give them the assignment, you give them exactly what they're supposed to talk about, you give them their thesis, kind of like what I did for you with essay number 2. It's very specific as to what you're supposed to talk about. You were given a great deal of guidance in particularly how your paper was to be set up. Uh, but at the same time, then we had essay number 1, which was, well, I gave you some rough ideas about what the kinds of things that I wanted to see, but it was a little bit more open-ended to incorporate different discussions and what might pop up in those discussions. So that, that's an example of trying to incorporate both learning preferences in that in your assignments, having one that is a little bit more open-ended and one that is much more structured and defined. All right. In conclusion, um, again, it's just as we said before, it's important to understand how people learn, and not just as an educator, right? Not all of you are going to be educators in a formal sense, but most of you are going to find yourself at some point in your careers educating somebody else, either formally or informally. You are going to be around people who are going to be learning from you. As young people entering the workforce, the older, more experienced people are going to be learning your new ways of doing things, things that they didn't learn in school, because they teach things differently in school now than they did when we were older or when we were younger. So they're going to be learning from you. You're going to be teachers. You're going to be learning from them. Differences in learning preferences and understanding those differences in learning preferences and expectations are going to help you further your career and help you to learn further from these people. Um, Also, then when you get to be the more experienced person, you're going to be wanting to convey that experience or the knowledge of that experience to people who are just entering the workforce, and you're going to be able to need to understand how they learned so that you can help them to be the best that they can be. All right. So that is this is the last chapter we're going to be discussing in this class, and so therefore, I hope you're as happy as I am about that. Okay. All right. We'll talk to you later.